So, Brandon, my first question is regarding the Geneva peace talks. What do you make of Mohammed Alouche leaving the peace talks? Do you think that with him gone now, the talks may be more successful?
Well, I guess it depends on how you interpret better or worse. I mean, he's pulled out of the talks, and the High Negotiations Committee has also suspended their participation in the talks as well. So this ceasefire agreement at this point has all but totally collapsed. I know the United Nations is not saying that it's giving up on the peace talks, but it's not setting a date for the resumption of those peace talks. So in other words, this is sort of an indefinite suspension here. So it looks like the peace talks may very well be over. I was not a fan of the peace talks to begin with, to be honest with you. Every time we see a situation in which the Syrian army is gaining ground on whether it's ISIS or any of these identical groups that are out fighting the Syrian government, anytime the military gains control over a situation, starting to gain ground, starting to show signs it's about to retake Aleppo or it's about to totally close in on the terrorist positions in Damascus, for instance, then we see the United Nations, usually talks spearheaded by the United States, and NATO countries that cry, "Oh, we want peace talks. We want peace talks." And this is essentially a sort of timeout for the NATO powers, right? It's when they're losing, they call for ceasefires, and that gives them an opportunity to have some breathing room, to rearm, to restructure, to reorganize, and to send in more terrorists. And of course, the semantics that are played in this whole situation, where some terrorist groups are included, some of them aren't in the ceasefire agreement, that's sort of forcing the Syrian military to fight with one arm tied behind its back, because we all know there's virtually nothing that keeps these groups separate other than a name change and some lower level ideological splits. There are virtually the same groups at the higher levels. So I'm not a real big fan of the peace talks. I understand why it was done. I understand the need for peace. I understand the need for Syrian civilians to not have to be living in the middle of some type of live fire situation. I get it, and I get why Russia would have agreed and pushed forward with it, and I understand why Syria would take part in it. But I also understand that what this really is not a genuine ceasefire on the part of the West or on the part of the terrorist organizations. It's time out. When they're starting to get beat, they cry, "Time out! Give us a break. Let's regroup. Let's reorganize." And then once they've done that, then we generally see the terrorist organizations breaking the ceasefire, whether it's car bombs, whether it's military maneuvers and that sort of thing. We see it being broken, and then we see that everything start to devolve once again into full-scale war, where the Syrian military and the terrorists are basically on equal footing in terms of the battle situation. So whether or not the talks are going to be better or worse for Alouche being gone, I don't know. I mean, the talks are virtually over now anyway, and we see Russia is now bombing Ahrar al-Sham positions, and good, they should be bombing them, but this was something that was more difficult for them to do while these ceasefire talks were taking place.
You mentioned Ahrar al-Sham. I'm wondering what your opinion is about the United States pressing to allow them to have a seat at the negotiating table in Geneva, when many of the other parties involved in the peace talks would consider them to be a terrorist organization.
Right. I understand that point too. I'm not in favor of including them, and that's my reasons why. Right? This isn't including a terrorist organization into a ceasefire agreement. Ahrar al-Sham, they try to present this organization as if it's a moderate rebel, but what the hell is so moderate about them, right? They might make up half of the so-called Syrian opposition, but they've committed atrocities. They've killed civilians. There was a situation in Al-Zara where they had abducted civilians, they had executions, indiscriminate killings, they've had beheadings. I mean, what's so moderate about Ahrar al-Sham? Why should they be included in the ceasefire agreement. In my personal opinion, and I think a lot of people would agree with me here, is to leave them out of the ceasefire negotiations and just bomb them. Let Russia bomb them. Let the Syrian military destroy them. I have no interest in seeing Arar al-Sham in anything other than completely destroyed. This group is fighting right alongside ISIS. It's fighting right alongside Nusra, and these two groups are not included in the ceasefire, right? This is essentially their battle partners on the ground. So why include them? If they include them, again, I go back to what I said earlier. This is essentially their timeout, right? We're getting beat, so we want to break until we can get our wind back, and then come back into the fight. I don't think that's a good idea, and of course the U.S. is pushing for it because they want to have their terrorist proxies protected by a ceasefire agreement, which is not in good faith. I have no support for adding Arar al-Sham to the peace negotiations committee.
You mentioned Nahal al-Sham. I'm wondering what your opinion is about the United States pressing to allow them to have a seat at the negotiating table in Geneva when many of the other parties involved in the peace talks would consider them to be a terrorist organization.
Well, I think it's hypothetical because, I mean, for one thing, I have no doubt that they represent the pure form of the revolution. Again, what did I describe earlier? As beheadings, murdering civilians, indiscriminate killings, executions, all this stuff. Yeah, I think that embodies the so-called Syrian revolution pretty well. In terms of their political support, there is an opposition in the Syrian political sphere, right? And there was a political opposition prior to the so-called revolution, and then there were even more opposition figures, but these were reasonable amounts of opposition, right? This was not beheadings and Sharia. This was a disagreement over maybe the way funds are allocated or the levels of corruption, that something had to be done about that. Foreign policy, right? In other words, reasonable political disagreements between politicians in the parliament. And this was the makeup of the Syrian government. And there still is opposition. If the so-called rebels wanted to support the real legitimate opposition that was operating in Syria, then they've done a horrible job because they've united virtually everybody who's not actually a part of the foreign-backed invasion, right? They've united the members of parliament who are opposed to many of Assad's policies. They've had a massive rally round effect, right? For the last 5 years, this has been the case. And as you point out, this was a group that was bombing the polling stations. A lot of these rebel groups were not even allowing voting to take place under their watch to begin with. So I don't think that there's any legitimate political support for Arar al-Sham in either the Syrian parliament or Syrian society. Remember, these guys are not necessarily representatives of the Syrian people. This is a foreign-backed and foreign-staffed revolution. You can't really call it a revolution. It's an invasion, right? Most of these guys are not Syrian. Most of them come from other parts of the world. So I don't see how they can legitimately claim that we represent the Syrian opposition when they're mostly not Syrian.
The past few weeks have seen people such as yourself, Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, Tim Anderson, and other people critical of the movement, the hashtag Aleppo is burning. What is your general feeling about how the media is covering the current offensive by the Syrian army in Aleppo?
Well, the media is always, the mainstream media is always going to take every opportunity that they can to show death and destruction in Syria, and then take those images and then blame it on the Syrian government, right? If a tree falls in Syria, it's because Assad is a brutal dictator and demanded that it be cut down because it's not Alawite, right? That's what the mainstream media would report it as. And look at the groups that are leading the charge on this Aleppo is burning stuff, right? The ones that are taking part. Right? You can even look at the major human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, which have completely, if they had any credibility at all, it's gone with the Syrian crisis. They have absolutely destroyed their reputation in that regard when they present photos that were taken 3 days earlier at other locations, and then present it as if Assad had committed some bombing, or if they take photographs of a U.S. bombing in Ain al-Arab, for instance, and then they say that is somewhere else that the Syrian government bombed. This is beyond disinformation. These are outright lies by these organizations. So it's just really there's been an effort by the media to show the Syrian situation and the humanitarian disaster that it is to the American people and to the people of the West, and justify it on the base of humanitarian intervention. It's not the same sell as the neocons had under the Bush administration, where it was open invasion, war, kind of extreme open-faced imperialism with ground troops and so forth. This is now the humanitarian intervention version of Samantha Power and Obama and Biden, where it's because these people are in such a horrible shape. It's never mentioned that they're in that horrible shape because of the policies of the West, because they funded proxy fighters to go in and destroy Syria. That is being used as a justification for U.S. involvement. And so there is a major humanitarian crisis happening in Syria, and specifically happening in Aleppo, but that is that's the fault of the West. And I point to all these situations. To be honest, I did an article recently. There's this disease. I don't want to get too far off topic, but I got a point here. There's a disease called cutaneous leishmaniasis, right? This is this disease that's sort of a flesh-eating bacteria. It's really horrible looking, and it's grown across Syria and across the Middle East, and they fear that it could be spreading to Europe because of the refugee situation. Now, in the article that I did about that, I laid the blame for the spread of that disease on the United States and NATO. And some people who read that might look at it and say, oh, my God, is there anything the United States and NATO aren't responsible for? In Syria, no, it's not, because this situation never would have happened. We would not have had 250,000 dead Syrians if it were not for the policies of the United States and NATO, and I include the GCC and Israel in that as well. We would not have seen 5 years of war and chaos without the policies of the U.S. and NATO. We wouldn't have seen the destruction of Syrian infrastructure, of civilian infrastructure, the health infrastructure, and the spread of disease if it were not for the policies of NATO and the United States. And I could go on and on. Everything that's happened with this so-called revolution, this so-called Arab Spring and Syrian rebel situation, is the fault of the United States and NATO, because it never would have happened had they not gone in and tried to overthrow Assad in 2011. So I lay that right on the feet of the United States and NATO, the situation in Aleppo.
You brought up a fantastic point that I'd like to elaborate on a little bit. You mentioned how the neocon position not so much different than the new liberal hawk position. You know, it might sound different, and it might be a little bit harder to swallow to people on the left, but nonetheless, the people on the left still are inadvertently supporting conflicts. But rather now it's on some bleeding heart, appeal to emotion basis of, we need to go into this country, wherever it may be, to help the people, to liberate them, from their oppressor, or, whatever the rhetoric is that day. Don't you think that it's a little interesting how it's all played out in the media, and if you listen to the press releases?
Well, Empire has justified itself in a number of different ways in order to gain public support back home. I mean, remember, at some point, we have the European powers claiming that they were going in and civilizing savage peoples, right? I don't know if you could consider that humanitarian intervention. I guess that's a matter of really distorted perception. But there is that. But we have a situation here in the United States where both parties are the war parties. It's just a matter of branding, right? With the Republican crowd, you get the massive, tough guy attitude. You want ground troops bombing, just scorched earth policy and warfare everywhere. Take all the oil and whatever resources they have. But on the left, you have this, again, as we just mentioned, the humanitarian bombing, the responsibility to protect foolishness that didn't begin with the Obama administration, right? We had this under the Clinton administration as well. But this idea of that the United States has not only the right, but the responsibility to go into another country where there's some type of tragedy or humanitarian catastrophe and intervene. This is empire just changing brands every 4 to 8 years. And as we can see, that's going to happen in the next brand change we have in 2016. That's just simply going to continue, and it's just going to be a matter of how they present it. Again, this is not something that's necessarily new, but it's something that the people on the left have been silent, largely silent. There's been a trickle of anti-war talk, but the people on the left largely remain silent. Starting in 2008. It's funny how war can be bad, and then all of a sudden, on Inauguration Day, it's suddenly non-existent or a good thing, right? I've actually heard so many people on the left ask me when I talk about, and I'm critical of the war, and by that I mean, Libya, Syria, the policies in Yemen, and of course we are still in Iraq, and we're still in Afghanistan this many years on. I mentioned criticisms of the war, and I've had people on the left actually ask me, what war? What war are you talking about? Because they actually have no concept that there is either combat or destabilization taking place, and that's how far the disconnect goes. Now, you tell that to people on the right, and they just don't give a damn at all, but people on the left who claim to be anti-war are so embedded in this delusion that there's nothing even happening simply because there's a Democratic administration. That's very dangerous.
When we talk about the PR strategies for marketing interventionist policies, I think it's really important that we remember the media, and not even in such a blatantly obvious way as it sometimes is, but just in the rhetoric that they use. I wanted to ask your opinion about the bombing in Tartus. Where there was many people killed by ISIS had claimed responsibility, though there's much doubt that it was ISIS. But the way that the media said it was something like, they had bombed a Syrian army stronghold, the Loyalist coast was bombed by terrorists, and you hear the same thing all the way through. So, how do we interpret this connotative rhetoric when we're talking about casualties and so on?
Well, I think you hit the nail right on the head, and that's a perfect example of whenever one of these so-called rebel groups will bomb civilians, it's always, if it's reported at all, will always be reported as if it were targeting the Syrian military and only killed Syrian military soldiers, right? Apparently, according to the mainstream media, when the Syrian military fires a bullet, it always hits a civilian. When a Syrian rebel fires a bullet, it always hits a Syrian soldier, and there's no in between, right? Nobody can hit anybody else, because when the rebels commit an atrocity, again, as I said, if it's at all reported and not just simply blamed on Assad, if there's dead people anywhere in Syria and the media gets a hold of it, they say Assad did it. We've had numbers of occasions where this has happened, right, where there were massacres. I believe one was in Hama, where the mainstream media said that the Syrian military went in and executed all these people. Of course, the victims were Alawite, and it turned out that it was the rebels who went in. They claimed at first that it was the Syrian military that shelled civilians for supporting the rebels. It turns out that the rebels had come in and actually walked behind them and put bullet holes in their heads and stabbed them. But to the viewing audience, that was not distinguishable, right? Because they had already gotten the original story that Assad had committed an atrocity. And this is what happens, right? Assad kills rebel fighters. He's presented as, well, the Syrian military kills rebel fighters. They're presented as either killing activists, freedom fighters, or civilians, right? Usually it's civilians is the go-to until it can be proved otherwise in subsequent investigations. And we saw that what happened in Tartus and Jobla, right? Remember when there were bombings in Belgium, when there were bombings in Paris, it was everybody had to express solidarity. People changed their Facebook profile pictures to the French flag and the Belgian flag, and everybody wept over these people in France and Belgium. That's fine, but nobody weeps over the people in Syria, right? Where was the international condemnation of the bombings in Jobla and Tartus? Where was the I Stand with Syria solidarity movement, right? Where were all the people changing their profile pictures to Syrian flags in the same method and way that they did for Paris and Belgium? There weren't any, because the media didn't tell them to do it like they did for Paris and Belgium. One of the other things I would point out too is that I find it funny. The Syrian media reported after the bombings that it was Ahrar al-Sham that committed the bombings. On the other hand, you have the United States saying that it was ISIS and that ISIS claimed credit for it. Kind one can argue either way, that it actually would benefit the Syrian government to blame Ahrar al-Sham, since we've kind of been discussing them tonight, because it's a major controversy. Should they be included in the peace talks? They do make up half of the opposition. But the United States would also benefit from it not being Ahrar al-Sham, right? So you talk to Syrians, and they will tell you the bombers were Ahrar al-Sham. And if you look at the areas where they're at, ISIS doesn't necessarily have a presence there. And again, I distinguish these groups only by a name change, not in ideology, not in methods, and not in their connections to Western intelligence agencies. Just a name change, but still, if you want to go by the name change, ISIS doesn't have a stronghold. They don't have a presence in Tartus and Jobla, but Ahrar al-Sham does. So that should be duly noted, especially when we're talking about whether or not these groups should be included in the peace talks.
It is a little impressive, is it not, the level to which the bleeding hearts in the public, members of the academic community, journalists, and other people in the intelligentsia, how they can be so quickly sold on these very contrived and very biased solidarity movements, such as Aleppo's burning and the result after the attack in Brussels and after Paris.
It really is, and it is complex, because remember when this first started, this was presented as what the left loves to see, right? People power, people out on the streets protesting. Of course, they didn't necessarily show the snipers on the roofs from the very beginning of the protests in Syria, and they used this element to get this element of hope struck within people who were paying somewhat attention. And I would specify that when we talk about the average person here, I don't even know if that's accurate, because the average person doesn't pay any attention at all. There are people who do follow the news and or conservative or liberal, but they're actually a minority. But the complexity here is that not only is Assad painted as a brutal dictator, and not only is it now inescapable to show that the rebels are committing massive atrocities and are what one would think traditionally would be the opposite of what so-called liberals would want to see in a society, right? Theocracy, violence, rape, and no respect for women, no women's rights, all that kind of stuff is actually, that's presented as the face of the revolution. And then you have to show all of this chaos and destruction enough to get them to understand that there's a humanitarian crisis, but also in order to get them to support it. So it's complex. It's in a way it's simple, but it's also complex. And it's also very tragic. And again, after the bombings in Paris and Belgium, we saw Western leaders crying on TV for victims and putting on quite a show for the Western public. But they don't tend to cry at all when it becomes an issue of Syrian children being killed. In fact, nobody seems to cry when it comes to Syrian children, and that includes all of these groups, right? And I would say to particularly people on the left who are supposedly anti-war, what does that say about you, that you can cry about the French children and the Belgian children, or the French people and the Belgian people, but the Syrian people you have not one word to say? Does that mean that you believe that Belgian lives and French lives matter more than Syrian lives? And I think that's relatively clear in the minds of the general public that's the case. And maybe not on a level of basic humanity, but certainly on a level in which they've been told that certain tragedies are worth getting upset about and other tragedies are not. They're just a course of warfare.